thought for years, have a Cyberman in the TARDIS, have that as a companion, a bit like Chameleon. Doesn't have to be in every episode, but there's so many ways you can generate spin-offs, which to me, I think have the possibility of going forward.
Welcome to Cast Service. I'm Christian Cawley in my slightly tidier office than it was last week, and he's James McLean. There probably isn't going to be Doctor Who for a couple of years, I would have thought, in the sense that there's no Doctor Who right now. It takes several months to start a new TV show and finish a TV show and schedule a TV show, so it's unlikely there's not going to be any Doctor Who this year. There's probably not going to be any Doctor Who next year.
It's weird when that sort of period in '86 with the 18 months seemed, that seemed like an eternity.
Yeah.
But then I think this also comes down to what we'll talk about a bit again, which is the lay of the landscape has changed, which I think is something which is always interesting to talk about.
Yes. So we're kind of looking at this time, and you don't need to have listened to last week's, but it does provide a lot of context for what we're going to be talking about today, I suspect. What do we do in a world where there is no Doctor Who on TV as a long-term thing? How does Doctor Who survive that in the modern era, not in 1989 through to 1996 and on to 2005, but now in a completely different world? Now, you might be thinking, crikey, that's why are you doing this, Christian? Don't blame me, it's his idea. But I think it's a really good discussion to be having because, once upon a time, there was a world of comic books and novels. Things have changed quite a bit. I mean, obviously, there was video games back then as well, but Doctor Who and video games is something James and I discuss quite a lot, so we're not going to get into that today for your benefit.
But I think what we're talking about is, as you say, so much of the discourse around Doctor Who, especially from fan content, always 80%, 90% of the time neglects the fact that the circumstances and surroundings of what we're talking about has changed.
Yeah.
And so then compares the previous era and goes, look how things are different, on the assumption that the circumstances are the same, and therefore the difference can be quantified by quality of the show or of the people behind it or whatever. And it's like, that's not where we are now. And I think what we're talking about today, while last week we were kind of talking about the show itself, this week we're sort of looking like how does the lay of the land sustain itself compared to how it sustained itself, as you say, in 1989? Can it sustain itself when the terrain is so different? And I think that is quite an interesting conversation to have.
Where do we start with this then? Do we start with like a comparison of that time? I mean, I was looking at something that just popped up in my feed the other day, some sort of zombie-based superhero reboot mini series. And back then, rebooting anything was a very brave thing to do, whereas now rebooting's kind of baked into a lot of projects and franchises. It's something Doctor Who's never done, but other shows do it and other franchises do it a lot. Star Wars has kind of shied away from it, but very much in the comic area of Marvel and DC. Jurassic Park, in a way, that's a reboot. They haven't contradicted anything, but the first movie, the Jurassic World, certainly didn't have any reliance on the earlier movies. And there's other examples of this. So rebooting's a thing, but it's not really something that's happened with Doctor Who in the past. So we're talking
about hard rebooting, really, rather than like the soft reboot, which things like Jurassic Park and Doctor Who have done to some degree.
Yeah. 30 years ago, that would be like, this is kind of a bit of a risk, and this isn't what people want.
Because we talked about this a little bit last week, didn't we? About, as you say,
a tiny bit, yeah.
About would we like a hard reboot of Doctor Who, and what would that look like?
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting one because I think the first thing one has to do, and this is very difficult, and I have talked this at length with people in a professional capacity. It's like a reboot is an adaptation, and it's like, again, with adaptation, it's like we kind of what is the heart, what is the spirit of what you're taking and moving on. I think an interesting one to look at is which was a successful hard reboot would be Battlestar Galactica, where you take that original show and you translate it over. And I think the interesting thing with adaptation is that even with scholars, there's this sort of notion of like, what is a good adaptation? this is how you do a good adaptation. It's like, well, what is a good adaptation? You can look at Battlestar Galactica and you can split it down. People who absolutely hated that and did not feel it was authentic to the original. And there were those who thought it was a really interesting adaptation and taking it into a new era. So I suppose with Doctor Who, your first question is like, what do you keep? What do you throw away? And I don't think that's necessarily just down to things like police box and characters, but it's trying to understand what perhaps Doctor Who was. And I think that is probably the big issue. And it's the same issue Batman has, is that whenever you come into Batman is your Batman. Or as we've said before, whenever you come into Doctor Who is kind of what your benchmark of Doctor Who is.
Yeah.
So kind of isolating Doctor Who, a 60-year show which has survived because it soft reboots itself so often. How do you sort of decide what are the qualities, ingredients that you pull into your next iteration of it? And I think that's a hard one for Doctor Who, because like Battlestar Galactica was like it's one season show. If we ignore Battlestar Galactica 1980, which of course we should.
Should.
So it's nice and easy to some degree distill kind of what Battlestar Galactica is, but a 60-year show, how do you do that? It's especially one which is largely, and as we've said before, an anthology with with a common character that runs through it. How do you I don't know. And I think that's the hard thing here. And I suppose you've got to decide who your audience is and then decide kind of what sort of elements of Doctor Who represent that audience or reflect that audience. Are you making it for 14, 15-year-olds? Are you making it for 40-year-olds? Are you doing what I don't think can be done as easily these days, doing it for a broad spectrum audience? And trying to work out kind of what would work, because that's the interesting thing, isn't it? Because when we talked about this last week, is, you know, to me, Doctor Who works at its best as being a sort of anthology where you have one character, a character you like, going into different situations. You're not quite sure what they're going to be each week, and the variety of that keeps it sustainable. But Doctor Who more in the last 20 years has been more about packages of season-long stories, which are split into chunks of events, which all link together towards an end outcome, and that's different. And that is obviously more of a modern take. Wednesday has just done that essentially, and it's season 2. That is what modern shows are doing. Or does it go incredibly serial, like Children of Earth or The Flux, or, you know, you see Alien Earth success, which is kind of that, you know, an 8-part long story. So I suppose that's the question: is what works for it, and also what does your audience want? Because I would like to see a return to that sort of 20th century version, but is there a market for that? Maybe if it's done in a way which is different, I think possibly, but yeah, that's the hard thing. It's like what the hell is this show? How do you reboot it? What is its essential elements? Is it like you said last week, the McGann Bible? Is it the early McGann Bible? Is it that? Is it about giving it actually a world? Because that's the problem we've said about this before in our 15 years of talking with the video games. Is the problem with Doctor Who is there is no real framework outside of a police box and a madman in his box. Everything else is everywhere. So how do you create a framework to do that in a video game is very hard. You know, the freedom is there's nothing there. Role-playing games almost impossible again because everyone wants to be a variant of the Doctor and no one wants to be a companion. You know, it's that sort of thing. How do you do that in a world which doesn't really have a framework to create a game or create a world in?
Yeah. Well, if we pull out then and we take a sort of more holistic view of this, in terms of where other franchises have been resurrected more recently than Doctor Who, Star Wars would seem to be the obvious one to look at because it kind of tailed off in the mid 80s after the Caravan of Courage, which we were talking about a few minutes ago, and of course at the Droids TV show, etc. It kind of became a bit passe. There was no special editions. The old prints looked absolutely terrible when they were screened on TV, etc., etc., etc. That then slowly came back with a new series of novels, which then had their kind of their crowning glory with the Timothy Zahn trilogy. And then when the video game era came along, you've got Star Wars, which ties back to what we were just saying. Star Wars has done immensely well through video games. Now, it's had graphic novels and miniseries, etc., over the years, but I would say that I think there's a fair argument in favor of a lot of the interest in Star Wars movies from younger generations that didn't see them the first time round, or didn't see the or maybe weren't interested in the prequel trilogy, comes from video games. Uh, because there's a vast series of very good video games that don't put you in control of a key character. They'll introduce a new character, or they'll give you control of an army, etc.
But I think another thing that video games can do, which, as you said, books and comics struggle with, is that Star Wars and Doctor Who, to a degree, are very aesthetic mediums in terms of visual and audio. So, you can think of the first Force Awakens trailer, the roar in cinemas when the Millennium Falcon engines powered through the surround and up into the air.
Yeah.
You can't do that in a comic. You can't do
No,
it in a
no.
book. And I think, yes, so things like Star Wars, in a weird way, the Timothy Zahn novels were the kind of the peak for the extended in terms of its legacy and memory, even though a lot of people say there's a lot of great stuff that followed, and I'm not saying there isn't. But those first three novels kind of set the ground, set the tone. But I don't think, in a weird way for me, when I read them back when they came out, I remember them not feeling they captured Star Wars for me. And I think possibly because as an adaptation, Star Wars to me, a lot of it is in the sensory stuff. It's not really the world, it's the look, it's the sounds, it's a vibe, it's a mood as much as it is as an actual living place. And I never felt that the books really could capture that very easily. And I certainly think the comics, as with the Doctor Who, struggled. And almost, as we said with Doctor Who, as you said last week, the Doctor Who comics almost feel like a different universe that
Yeah,
exists
yeah,
in its own
yeah,
right, has its
yeah.
own sort of style. And I think the Star Wars one, certainly the ones in the 80s, where they were whack, to be kind, with some very unusual characters in them, felt like their own space because they couldn't capture those elements of that adaptation. So, and which video games can. And I think if you look back into the 90s, I know we said we wouldn't talk about video games, but with Star Wars videos like Dark Forces, and it was the sense of sitting on a PC and hearing and seeing the sort of stormtrooper rifles, or hearing the sounds, and TIE fighter, hearing sort of they sort of invoked something which the comics and books couldn't do. And I
Yeah,
think going
absolutely.
back to Doctor Who on this, which I think, because I think you've got, is a really interesting point. Doctor Who will struggle with that because Doctor Who has never really managed to do it in that video game world in the same way. It's not something about it. And I think, again, that's because while there are certain sounds attached to you to think of Doctor Who, the TARDIS, sonic screwdriver, maybe the anthem, the theme, there's not a set aesthetic, there's not a set visual, there's not really a set soundscape to it beyond that. While Star Wars has a very, very specific hook in its soundscape and aesthetic, which is why Andor, I think, did very well, is because it was very keyed in to capturing and evolving those aesthetics in its world building.
Well, yeah, I think you're probably right there. I think also that Doctor Who, I do, the more I think about Doctor Who video games, I do think that maybe they just try and do too much and overcomplicate things when it could probably just be a lot simpler and a lot more fun and not be too heavy into things. But that's another conversation entirely.
But I suppose that again is an audience thing as well, because if you think of Doctor Who as a TV show, certainly in the 20th century, a little bit in the 21st, there is actually quite a lot of detective grounding in it. It's a man who comes into a scene where something's happened. Often someone has died,
Mm.
or they find a body, or there is a conspiracy which has to be demystified.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, oh, this is going to be one of those really annoying situations where my brain has gone to where my point was. Yes, so in terms of video games, you really, to capture Doctor Who, you've got to have something which probably isn't what video games are best suited for. Certainly for popular content, which is something
Mm.
a little more slow paced, something more mystery, something more open field, which is hard to do. While Star Wars, is straight action. I mean, if you look at Star Trek, you'll see a lot of Star Trek fans complain about their video games because invariably a lot of those video games end up being shooting things. ships
Yes.
shooting things, phasers shooting things, and they'll be like, but that's not what Star Trek is. I want to go around the galaxy and take diplomats from one place to another and then have some issue, or I want to explore a barren, strange new world, and there might be something there that might not, but that doesn't sell content. So again, it comes back to your demographics, doesn't it? And who are you shaping your thing for, and what do they want? And I think Doctor Who is an incredibly complicated one to move to a different medium outside of television where it's been, and it's even complicated in that space.
Yeah, I was a couple of points on video games again, just related to that. One of the first games I ever played on the Commodore 64 was a Commodore 64 version of Star Trek, the old
Yeah,
text input game, where you
yeah.
don't see anything, but you know that there's a Klingon bird of prey nearby, and you
Hmm.
have to not be killed or run out of fuel. Another thing, I've just been playing a game called Road Warden on the Nintendo Switch, which is kind of a very slow paced uh kind of detective exploration RPG with traditional kind of static graphics, and then you have conversation. So graphics on one side of the screen, conversation on the other side of the screen, explore, etc., etc. It's strangely, I was very quickly drawn into it, and I think with that type of game being very much out of vogue for many many years, that could be a way in for something like Doctor Who to carry on in a new medium.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Doctor Who, it's not really been done yet, but Doctor Who would sit very well with a procedural generated game, which there
Mm,
are those out there. There are detective games which try and procedurally generate each time you play. Now,
right.
if that becomes more sophisticated, that could be something good for Doctor Who. You land and you've got a slightly different thing to deal with each time, which is kind of the same because Doctor Who, let's face it, does have kind of frameworks to it, but it's slightly different. That might work. I remember thinking back to Star Trek. I remember on the Amiga back in the 90s, for those who don't remember, as I say, realizing getting older and older, there was a massive 16-bit golden age, which followed the 8-bit golden age of the Spectrum and the Commodore, where a lot of the games were initially very much made by artisans in their houses, in their flats, and sold to local high street stores or mail order. In the 90s, the public domain for the Amiga and the Atari was big, and there was
Yes.
lots of discs that you could get of all sorts of things. And I remember one of them was a 2-disc Star Trek game, which I think Tobias Richter might have had some involvement in. I can't remember now. He certainly was doing a lot of what again you could buy on PD public domain discs of like 3D models of the Enterprise and stuff, which he was doing that were animated. And he now does stuff for some of the video games for Star Trek. Now he's doing models for them. So it's interesting how again that's led careers.
Yeah.
But they had a Star Trek game there, and it was quite simple, but it was quite pretty for 16-bit. And it was just done by an amateur, and you would go to different places, warp to different places, and deliver stuff or send people, and there'd be occasional things which you might have to shoot. But in a lot of ways, it felt far more like Star Trek than a lot of the Star Trek sort of bridge commanders and Star Trek Online and the stuff that you get these days, because it sat to those values. But would that bring in a market? Probably not, because people get
No.
bored with it very quickly. So again, that's where I think the video, in a weird way, if we're almost like firing off here books and graphic novels compared to video games, where video games can aesthetically recreate the world well. They can't do it in an often an authentic way that books and graphic novels kind of can in a way, but then the books and novels don't really feel quite that. So I think the interesting one that we probably need to address here is the audiobook, because that's obviously extremely important
Yes.
to Doctor Who,
Yes.
and it's an interesting middle ground.
Yes. Well,
Um,
that is exactly what I was going to come on to next, because we've had Big Finish since the late 90s,
mm.
and I think 99-ish, 98, 99. And in their time with Doctor Who, they've sort of increased their output considerably. Now, one would imagine that in a world where there is no Doctor Who, initially they might have like a bit of a boost, but at some point, depending on how long there's no Doctor Who on television, there's going to be an element of Big Finish kind of easing off, say, their satellite stuff and focusing more on a Doctor. Now, given audio books are expensive, compared with a lot of other produce. It's not the word I'm looking for. Items that we purchase, commodities, etc., consumables. Compared with podcasts, I mean, one of the things in my head was Big Finish switching to sponsored podcasts or subscription podcasts of their actual dramas.
So you mean, are we talking like fiction podcasts, like dramatic podcasts rather than
dramatic podcasts, yeah, because that's I mean that's a growing area of podcasting, isn't it?
Yeah, no,
So that's
I
one
agree.
thing, yeah.
Yeah, I think the problem for Big Finish as well is, and I don't know this, and obviously we see them trying to tap the new series quite frequently these days with, and successfully pulling in lead voices, and people to write for it. But is the audiobook demographic, where does that sit? And does it sit with the audience that needs to sustain it? Because I don't doubt, even though if you think back to 89, you potentially got Doctor Who fans who are in their 40s, 50s even. Even, I think that's a crazy thing to say, but dedicated Doctor Who fans. So when you suddenly get a plethora of books and then eventually audiobooks, you've got a base which kind of resonates with them. But if your younger audiences are now more into, as you say, sort of easy listening podcasts, shorter term content, as well as a saturation of content as well, what are the mediums which could sustain that interest in that show without it dying off? I think that's what I think is interesting. So people who watch, I mean, let's say, for instance, I was in 89, like 12, whatever, and Sylvester McCoy went off the air, and there was books that I could read, which were kind of aimed at me and a slightly older, the new adventure stuff. Eventually, there was videos I could afford if I was inclined. Showtime. There was all the probe. There was all the unofficial dramatizations which sat around Doctor Who, which would eventually kind of evolve into sort of where Big Finish is or would be. But where's that market now? And who is that market to keep that image? Because you want those younger people. Those younger people should be the ones to sustain it. Because we're going to die off, and they're the ones to perpetuate the legacy. How do you perpetuate the legacy with them? Because they care about it. There's a lot of people young people who love Jodie Whittaker, who loved Ncuti, who love the back catalogue as well. They exist. It's not saying, and they're hardcore as well. But how do you make sure that they don't deviate onto other stuff?
I do think it's podcasts. I think it's a podcast, 25-minute episodic podcast. Listen on the way to work, listen on the way home from work, whatever. You also don't need your crew, you don't need your sets, you don't need to get an actor on the set at a particular time or a location or whatever with the taxi driver and all that business. They can, as we saw during the lockdown years, they can even record their parts at home if necessary. I honestly think podcasts are the way to prolong, shall we say, Doctor Who in a not just Doctor Who, but particularly for what we're talking about now, Doctor Who in a post-TV era.
But
they are the modern take on the novels.
I mean, there's a sort of short form version of that as well. I mean, we've seen a market which has been growing in the States for very short form television content, which you buy into the service, stream into the library, and it's like very short excerpts. So, do you sustain it by doing something like that? Do you buy into something where you get your actors in and get 90 minutes, but it goes out, it's written and deliberately made so it can go out in like 4-minute blocks, and you keep people on, So I think you're right. So it's like, and this is where I think the interesting thing is in this conversation. How do you do what was done then now? Well, now is nothing like then.
Yeah.
And I think that's an interesting thing for Doctor Who. And there's so many more temptations now. That's the problem. Last year I was big into Walking Dead. This year, not really thought about it because I'm now onto other things. And that's how things are, even for hardcore fans. There's a lot of things to hardcore fan about.
I on a completely different note, but it has its similarities in terms of longevity and spin-offs. Kerry and I have just expanded our Amazon Prime subscription to Paramount Plus in
Hmm.
order to watch the new NCIS Tony and Ziva spin-off, which is mind-blowingly, surprisingly nothing like NCIS. It's really good. James Darcy's in it as well. Really, really good. Surprised me how good it. I just thought it was going to be like run-of-the-mill NCIS, but in Europe, it's completely different. And but that's a kind of like I've watched other NCIS spin-offs, and none of them have really felt as good as the main show. Maybe a handful of seasons of other ones or whatever. Whereas this is something that really stands out, and maybe and it's leading in terms of it's coming out before the main series comes out. Now we've got a Doctor Who spin-off coming along, and there isn't a show that's coming straight after that. But I do wonder whether in a new Doctor Who era, if the show's not on air and you're able to do spin-offs to then bring the show in, or if whether it's on TV or in some other medium, I do I just kind of feel sometimes that, or quite often actually, that with Doctor Who and with a lot of British television, really, where there's other possibilities that haven't been embraced, those but I mean, I've just said it. The possibilities aren't embraced. There's
Yeah.
I mean, NCIS is on its like it's. I mean, when did it start? 2003. It's on its second wave of spin-offs. It's had
Mm.
like 3 spin-offs. It's now got another 3 spin-offs. Doctor Who's like struggled with spin-offs aside from Sarah
But
Jane
then
Adventures, really. And go on.
these are just to me, these are really weird spin-offs. Now, Sarah Jane, I get because it
Yeah.
was deliberately aimed at a younger audience, and they obviously felt that Elizabeth Sladen had the personality and could carry a vibe that would just sit there. And I think that was a good call.
Hmm.
But Torchwood, this class, to me, there's a no-brainer here. And the only thing which I think, and no, this is a no-brainer, is that people watch, it's like they don't feel like Doctor Who particularly, except when they put Doctor Who pieces into them, because they're not kind of what Doctor Who's about. If you want to do a Doctor Who spin-off, look at how the superhero genre works. You do a superhero with a slight twist. You do a doctor with a slight twist. You do a story. I mean, the obvious one is the Master. You do an anti-hero thing. You
Yeah.
obviously you might have to. Well, they with Missy, they did start to mellow her at the end, make her likable. You do the anti-hero thing. The Master is an obvious one. You do a Doctor Who character who is not the who is another Time Lord, who has another set of problems, doing the same sort of things the Doctor does, but in a slightly different way. Now, you could argue the show just does that built in because every Doctor is slightly different. So it is almost like watching a different Time Lord do the same sort of stuff. And that is true. But if you're trying to spin that off, to me, that is how you do it. You don't try and center it into the.
Yeah. Well, Big Finish have done it with a Master, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely. They've done it with
They did it
Iris.
with Davros a few years ago as
Yeah,
well.
yeah, absolutely. And that to me is that's where the interest is. And it does blow my mind, and I could be wrong, and it could be a belter. But to me, the Sea Devils and Silurians is a very limited concept. And I don't think it's ever massively resonated with fandoms, let alone larger audiences, to merit redoing in a weird, because it feels, without being rude, it feels like it's redoing the same issue, which is what that framework is about: tension between ownership of land and sea, interchangeably
Mm.
between humans and another. We've seen the Doctor do that a lot of times, and there's not much scope beyond that. To me, I'd be looking for things which have got scope rather than limited scope. Now, you could find a master series. You get the right actor in there, or the right actors if there's a regeneration. I'm watching Slow Horses at the moment, only on season 2. And, you think of beyond that, Ashes to Ashes, House MD. Everyone loves a sly superhero, a sly anti-hero. You know, give him. I could be almost willing to bet that you might find that the Master would return and Doctor Who would get cancelled, because that's the sort of spin-off I think they should be thinking about, rather than, or doing something really left-wheeled, like left field, like Cyberman or something, and have a rogue Cyberman who's got to survive on Earth. That would be I think that would be really interesting from, a Cyberman's perspective, who maybe has some slight memories. They did it with Bill to a degree, which I think worked quite well at the end of Capaldi's reign as the Doctor. Do that. The comics have had him have a, Cyberman as a sort of almost sympathetic
Yeah.
protagonist character. to me, that's a no-brainer. I've thought for years, have a Cyberman in the TARDIS, have that as a companion, a bit like Chameleon. Doesn't have to be in every episode, but there's so many ways you can generate spin-offs, which to me, I think have the possibility of going forward. And you could still set them on Earth. Yeah, I know a spin-off is risky for especially for things like the BBC in terms of costs. Still set on Earth. I mean, you could do one where the master is by some higher entity. I don't know, the White Guardian, whatever, is being punished for his crimes and has to rehabilitate in London, Earth 2027, and his TARDIS is no longer works. And you reset the unit era, but for the master, that would be interesting. And to me, that is where the show should be trying to do its spin-offs in things which, because I think the Doctor or variations of the Doctor is really the heart of what Doctor Who is, and anything that doesn't have that struggles to find its identity. And I think with Sarah Jane's Adventures, it found its identity without the Doctor. I never watched it thinking you need the Doctor. Its framework was separate. Even though you had K9 and his occasional appearances and some of the baddies, you didn't need them. Torchwood, I felt, was a mess because it didn't really seem to ever know what it was. And it's found who it was in Children of Earth and then forgot who it was by,
Lost it. Yeah.
yeah, because it didn't have a set identity. It didn't know at the heart what it was. Was this really about Torchwood or was it about Captain Jack? Was this just a Buffy clone or was this something more
Scooby-Doo.
deeper? Or was it Scooby-Doo? It just didn't know what it was. And so it just felt like a very odd beast, which I don't think they knew what it was. I mean, the fact, the first couple of seasons, you've got their base under Cardiff, which feels like a bat cave, and they've got their stupid vans where they're meant to be inconspicuous, but they've got Torchwood plastered all over them, which feels very, as you say, almost Scooby-Doo. And then you destroy all that in Children of Earth, and you think, okay, this show's growing up, it knows what it is now, and then it does this bizarre American take, which again doesn't know what it was, who it is. And that's because I don't think it has any particular grounding or relevancy to its parent show to really give it a sense of what it's or who its market. It didn't know who its market was. But yeah, anyway, this is meant to be a knocking Torchwood. But I think, so I think if I was to do spin-offs which should sustain today, it would be doing variations on a theme, because the variations of a theme, that the theme that is popular. If they like the Doctor in the TARDIS, wait till you see the Master in the TARDIS, or wait till you see, I don't know, the pediatrician in the TARDIS. You whatever variant. No, not the pediatrician, but something. You could have. I don't know. You could have someone who's just totally off kilter in there, in a different way to the Doctor running the TARDIS. With really ambiguous to their ethics, that are very amoral, that could swing one way or the other. That could be interesting, which isn't quite the Master, isn't quite the Doctor. There's just ways to do it. Or, as I've said before in more recent podcasts, have a load of people find a TARDIS and have them caught in it, journeying from place to place. And, maybe that could be quite adult, where not all of them survive because they're not the Doctor.
Yeah.
And they could regenerate their crew by having different people join them in different spaces as others die off. And you've got a Walking Dead scenario, Walking Dead framework, with a police box. That could be interesting. But yeah, I think that is the problem. So if you're going to keep it going and you're thinking of spin-offs that isn't the show, I think you've got to keep it close to what the show is. And the show's just not done that yet, which is really weird in my head.
So we've got this idea of podcast audios. We've got an idea of spin-offs. I mean, you came up with this idea. So do you have some thoughts already in mind for, is this something that you've given thought to already?
What
Please say yes.
What to the idea of the sort of people finding the TARDIS?
No, the idea of the post Doctor Who being on telly. How does it survive until it comes back on telly, or does it turn into a movie? Does it just continue on as a thing that pops up every now and again?
Yeah, I think, and I think that's what's so exciting about talking about these things today, is because it's just so hard to work out where everything's going to go. Streamers, the streaming bubble is struggling, as we know. Cinema is struggling in its own way.
Yeah.
Personal content and social media content thrives, but there's always a bit of me which wonders, if you lost all the other stuff, would that stuff suddenly become far more fragile and frail and just be seen? Because to me, I mean, I don't know, obviously for young people, but it still feels like a lot of filler. you're filling with things, but you know you've got a TV show that you can go and watch tonight and get something to be absorbed in. If you lost all that, would that be a problem? So I don't know where it's going to go. I think, I think at the moment there's probably, I think that's, as we've said before, that's what's hindering Doctor Who. And we talked about this all the way through the Ncuti Gatwa era so far, is that it's a really unknown space for the show, and it's trying to do what we were saying for years, in credit to us, that it was probably going to have to do, and that's break out the BBC into a larger market, which is what it's
Yeah.
attempted to do. But that is a very complicated logistic, which is now kind of strangling and bottlenecking it. They got Disney, which I think probably was good for the show, regardless of what people feel of the quality or the style. But so getting that global platform seems sensible if you want it to survive. But that has led to this sort of slowdown, which I don't think is good for the show. I think all parties involved would have to admit that I don't think it's great to have uncertainty because the market's
No.
just too busy that people just forget. And that's the problem. While in the 90s, early 90s, Doctor Who disappears, you've now got nothing on British television, bar maybe a terrible attempt to refill the slot with something like The Crime Traveller or Bugs and whatever's filtering through from the American market, occasionally on Channel 4. So its absence is really notable, but now it's not. It
No. Yeah.
disappears. It disappears.
Um, I don't know if this is something that we can add to this conversation. But I don't know about you, but during the 90s, I'm just looking to see on if I've got one. There's various volumes by different writers, in particular Jean-Marc Lefisier, who's I think
Hmm.
probably the first or second person we interviewed on Casturbis many, many
Oh,
years
cool.
ago. And the reason for that, why I was interested to interview him, I think it was just by email, was because there was no Doctor Who on television, and he obviously created two or three of these reference books. And reading them, I was experiencing Doctor Who episodes that I'd never seen or that didn't exist anymore or whatever. And there's the encyclopedia, so you could the way these books were written, they there was almost a legendary element to
Mm,
what was written there because
mm,
there's no tangible way of you couldn't see it, and also because it wasn't on TV, so there's nothing referring back to it or whatever. It just felt like you were reading something sort of almost esoteric. There's like this secret knowledge that
mm,
you were gaining about Doctor Who.
mm.
And with the Virgin New Adventures as well, it felt like you were part of something that was very, very interesting, very entertaining, and that no one else was interested or entertained by. And I guess there is an element of that to Doctor Who on television now, up, up until recently. But I wonder if there's a kind of is were we and the people who have come to be running Doctor Who since 2003 onwards, if we talk about when the production started, those people were all involved in that. They were referencing that or looking back at that, and that kind of that distance between the old show and what would come on along later on is that period of renewal, is that actually something that's kind of, do we think that's something that's baked in? Is that actually going to be necessary? Is Doctor Who going to be off air for actually quite a long time until there's actually a nostalgic desire from the kids who were, 8 or 9 in 2005 through maybe till 2013, when they're in TV production and they're looking back thinking, well, we need something like Doctor Who now. It's been off air. We need to get it back on there. Are they going to be looking back at the show in that same kind of a slightly mysterious way?
But then you could almost argue it came back in 2005. Means there's 20-year-olds out there. You know,
Yeah.
they're they're the potential ones. I think it's funny when I've watched some reels of younger people who look like they're sort of late teens, early 20s, and they talk about Doctor Who and they'll say where Ncuti Gatwa's era has gone wrong. And I think that's interesting because there's always that. I mean, certainly I'm guilty of this. Well, I always say, well, yeah, the youth. This is a more young people who will get it, while us older people might not vibe with it in the same way. But it's interesting hearing them, and it's not, and a lot of the time it's because it doesn't reflect their interpretation. Again, going back to where you came into the show is where you see the
Yeah.
standard. So they remember sort of late Tennant, or maybe scary, Smith being the template. And if Moffat's your template and you look at Shooty, there is a massive difference in how the writing in the show works. And so, again, it comes to the going back to your point about cycles. This is that even within the show we see cycles, and we've said this many times before. You can almost track cycles between the classic era and the new era, not just in terms of the sort of time pit that passes and how you start to see the grumbles come in and the audience numbers start to drop as well, but also in kind of the choices for the doctors become a little more radical at the back end, a little more sort of trying to do different things because and trying to bounce off the previous. And you almost feel like you can see Whittaker as a Davison,
Mm.
compared to the sort of Capaldi sort of more traditional zaniness, and then you can look at you know you can see these sort of lines. I suppose you could see it the other way around. I suppose that's probably the problem with this. Capaldi is almost like the Colin Baker to a degree, maybe. I don't know. Who cares with this? But the point being is you can see these sort of tensions of the show trying to continually perpetuate itself against harder times, and the decisions not always working maybe in the same ways they would have, or being as well received as they would have been earlier, because like anything, eventually everything loses its spark. It has to, as we've
Yeah.
just said before. Surgeons wouldn't be able to operate if eventually you didn't become acclimatized to things. If the body every time you looked at it was just the same as when you first looked at the body, open body, you wouldn't be able to do your job. You've got to be able to acclimatize to it. And the same with TV. We eventually acclimatize, which is why I've always felt when people sort of say, oh, this later episode is trash. I think, yeah, put that later episode into an earlier Doctor when you thought it was great. You'd have probably thought it was great back then, but you've now got a different perspective because the shine's come off it. So you're not seeing it in the same sparkly way.
Mm.
But going back to your point, is the break a natural thing, and can it be a healing point for the show to a degree where it sort of recuperates? Possibly. I think the question is I don't think we can assume that cycle is permanent, because it's almost like saying, running on ice is always going to be permanent when eventually the ice can melt. You can keep running and keep breathing and stopping, but if the terrain changes, you can't perpetuate that movement. So the question is, if it goes, does it just get lost to the plethora of stuff which is out there, which will be in the people's memories, and they might want to return? A show which is even now still a callback to an era of television that worked very, very differently. Um, so I think some of the ways it could sustain itself, which I would probably be thinking about if, as a backseat driver, as I'm going to be, would be seeding. So by seeding, which is a word that I have just made up for this context, obviously seeding
Okay.
occurs in various other contexts, but I'm thinking about how you take the IP, and we've seen it done with Lego, and farm it out to products to sustain its memory. So you become a little more loose with the IP, so it becomes something which can be folded into other things,
Okay.
spin-offs, tie-ins, merchandise, that just keeps that memory alive while the show is not so visible. Um, and I think that can be quite a good way to find ways of just fighting the memory loss of it by continually just planting the 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 core sort of IP elements, those things which people, the triggers, into other various products which will benefit from it because they want to do something bigger or vast or zany. So video games, I mean, going back to Japan, Japan's done this for a long time for different reasons, but the reuse of characters and IPs in different products, uh, food, magazines, selling stuff, video games, and you'll see characters from various different IPs, especially in video games, appearing in sort of smash stuff. That's what I think Doctor Who needs to do, is to try and find ways to keep itself there in some way or another and to allow itself to exist. Um, I think that's a good way to alongside other ways of doing it. But I think, yeah, you've got to let go a little bit on the IP a bit, and maybe that's the place with fandoms as well, is to sort of give fandoms incentives to sort of perpetuate the IP. Is that somewhere? I don't know. I think if we've got to think of it in a market where you don't have clear pathways. And I think the pathways in the early 90s were very clear, even if they'd not been done before. Because I would still
Mm.
say the Doctor Who adventures for the Virgin did. I can't think of any other franchise, maybe outside of Star Wars, no, Star Trek, sorry, Star Trek, that had really sort of adapted itself to a different medium as a spin-off in quite that way that was not antithetical to what Doctor Who was as a TV show, but certainly broadened what the possibilities of
Roland,
Doctor
yeah.
Who was as a TV show. And I don't think even the Star Trek novels, and there were quite a few at the time, were doing that with the original Star Trek novels. So while that was a clear pathway that it could go from TV show to book, how it did that was quite different to how I think we had imagined shows would do that. And it became a very much more adult, and as you say, and I'll use this term, fan closure, which I have just coined. I don't know whether it exists elsewhere, but I sort of like where fans once again kind of almost reclaim that space which had become or had become public consumption. Because no one really outside of nerdy fans were reading the new adventures. It wasn't like the
No,
5 million
no,
people watching Doctor Who were now going over.
no.
As you say, it became very much back down to grassroots.
5.
Yeah, and that was exciting. I remember it just being excited because you just didn't know where those novels were going to go,
No.
and that it was I relished that time. And I think when it was some of our early podcasts when we talked about this, I think that was one of the things I said is, that was an era which I actually enjoy. Perhaps my memory of that more than any other era is an era of largely Sylvester McCoy ran Doctor Who books which were wild, dangerous, and edgy. And as a young person, that was exciting.
Yeah, yeah, it was. So and we're going to get towards wrapping this up in a moment, but I'm just intrigued as to because I really like the what you've been just saying there about fan closure and the other stuff, but the BBC's not going to do that, is it?
No,
We're being quite
no.
optimistic about all of this, but the BBC has very, over the years, had a very tight leash on Doctor Who. It's not going to do any of these things, I don't think.
And that's again part of the equation, isn't it? That's part of the
Yeah.
problem. But then a lot of IPs wouldn't. Um, but then it's going to be a question from here on. This goes back to what we said last week. There's nothing like Doctor Who. Nothing that sustains 60 years like this. That is a product of a mode of watching TV, which, let's face it, in 2005 hadn't changed that much by that point either. People were still watching TV and looking for it. Saturday nights were still kind of family nights. A
Yep.
lot of houses only had two televisions or so. They weren't like we weren't using phones all the time to watch content. So it was
No.
kind of a similar model, different, but it was still similar-ish.
You're getting TARDIS odes on your phone, maybe, but that's as far as streaming Doctor Who went.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was still very much the TV show as it was back in the 60s in a weird way. Not quite the same, but in a weird way
Yeah.
to where we are now. And I would think every franchise at the moment is going to struggle to work out how it perpetuates. And before we came onto this call, saying that with Star Wars, with the Mandalorian and Grogu, which I was reading some of the comments to the trailer yesterday, and it was interesting to see how lukewarm they were, because as you identified, the sort of style and the mood, and maybe let's call it the quality of it felt, or the narrative of it certainly felt uncertain. And again, I think Disney's in a position, or with that, it's like, where do we go with this franchise? Where do we take it? Uh, it'll be interesting to see whether they try and do another Andor, not obviously Andor season 3, because we know that's not going
That's
to
Rogue One.
happen. That's Rogue One, but something within that sort of framework of style. Is that something which audiences look for in television? But if they do, and as we know, that cost a hell a lot, are they willing to? It's the same with television all the time. Yeah, you could do it again, but would it get any more numbers than a cheaper thing of the
Yeah.
same? Do I do something really expensive when the same numbers become something cheaper, which is obviously where reality TV massively hit off in the 90s, was because, yeah, got a model of very cheap television here, which gets millions of viewers, and we don't have to spend too much money. So yeah, I think Star Wars has got that same struggle. And I'm not sure what the answer is. I know people go, "Oh, AI will make things cheaper," and it's like, but I think AI has a curse to it, as I've said before, that people
Yeah.
don't get any creative satisfaction out of it. So I think that is a space where it has to be subtle rather than prolific.
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're right. And that's I think we'll come back to AI in future, inevitably, almost. And of course, we'll come back to Doctor Who in future as well. But I'm very interested to know what you think in terms of, is Doctor Who going to be having a break? Is that what you think is going to happen? Is there a is there something you'd like to see the BBC do with Doctor Who to prolong it with James's seeding thing, or something similar? Is it there another? Do you think Doctor Who audio podcasts dropping into your phone every week, is that the future of Doctor Who for you until it comes back on TV? Let us know. Drop us some messages underneath this where you find this video or podcast. Email me at podcastobris@gmail.com. That's it. Thank you. Yes,
Okay.
that's the one. There's so many email addresses to remember. And that we'll wrap it up there. And so thanks for watching, and we'll speak to you again soon. Cheers.